The final months of World War II on Okinawa were marked by a constant fear that never seemed to subside. For the villagers of Kadena, life was not just about surviving the constant threat of bombs and bullets, it was about enduring the psychological weight of war. The enemy was portrayed as a monstrous, faceless force, and every waking moment was filled with the fear that one mistake, one misstep, could lead to their annihilation. The radio broadcasts, school teachings, and the propaganda circulated in the community painted a terrifying picture of the American soldiers, those who were said to be brutal, merciless, and unrelenting. The images fed to the people were designed to dehumanize the enemy, turning them into monsters in the eyes of the population. For the women of Kadena, especially those like Tomoko who were carrying new life, the emotional burden was even heavier. Expecting a child in such conditions felt like an act of defiance against fate itself. Each passing day was filled with tension, as the sounds of distant explosions would reverberate through their homes, shaking the earth beneath their feet. The village itself was a shadow of its former self, with homes and fields destroyed, leaving only crumbling remnants of what once was. The air, heavy with the scent of smoke and the constant rumbling of artillery, became the backdrop to every life, every interaction, and every prayer. Tomoko had been a widow for several years, losing her husband to the war early on. Now, with a new child on the way, she was left to navigate this dangerous world alone, trying to protect her two children from the violence that surrounded them. She was a mother first, but the pressure to keep them safe, to shield them from the horrors outside, was unbearable. There were no more celebrations, no more gatherings of families under the moonlight. All that remained was a bleak, unending struggle to survive. Her children, once free to run and play, were now confined to the small, dark spaces within the ruined houses. Their laughter, once a staple of life, had been replaced by the grim silence of waiting. The village was a place of preparation, not for victory or hope, but for death. Families began to gather poison pills, which were handed out by the local authorities, and knives were placed under beds, not as a means of protection, but as a last resort. If the Americans were to arrive, it was better to end things on their own terms than to face the horrors of surrender. The villagers were told again and again that there was no hope for them if they fell into enemy hands. The concept of surrender was painted as treasonous, a betrayal to the emperor and to Japan itself. To be captured meant a loss of honor, a fate worse than death. Tomoko's mind was constantly filled with the fear of what might come next. She spent her days preparing for the worst, her nights lying awake, listening to the sounds of distant gunfire and the occasional scream of someone caught in the crossfire. But even in this dark time, there was still something primal in her that clung to the hope that her child might be born in peace. She had been raised on the notion that life could still emerge in the most brutal of circumstances, that there was always room for a miracle. But as the bombs began to fall more frequently and the village grew quieter, Tomoko's optimism began to fade. Each day, she would walk through the ruins of her village, her feet crunching on the broken glass and debris that littered the ground. The once familiar streets were now dangerous paths, each corner hiding potential death. The faces of her neighbors had become hardened, their expressions gaunt from the constant stress of living under the threat of annihilation. No one dared to smile, no one dared to speak of a future. The war had consumed everything, even the smallest semblance of hope. As the months wore on, Tomoko's pregnancy began to show. Her belly grew, and with it, her fear. There was no safe place for her to rest, no peaceful corner where she could simply breathe. She slept with her children in the makeshift shelters, huddled in corners or beneath collapsed roofs. Each night was a prayer, a desperate plea that they would survive to see the next day. She knew the risks, and yet she refused to abandon the life growing inside her. Her survival instinct was stronger than ever, and despite the overwhelming odds, she could not give up on her child. The day the Americans began to approach the village, Tomoko's world shifted. The air grew heavier, and a sense of finality seemed to hang in the balance. The people of Cadena could feel it. The long-awaited moment had arrived. For days, there had been rumors of the American forces making their way toward the island, but now it was no longer a matter of if, but when. The soldiers, once mere figures of fear and hatred, were now coming to their doorstep. The villagers, already broken by the war, knew that their moment of reckoning had come. Tomoko had made her peace with the idea of death, but she never stopped fighting for her children's lives. As the first bombs began to fall, she crouched in her home, pulling her children close to her and preparing for the inevitable. The sounds of the explosions grew louder, closer, and her heart raced as she held them tightly. There was no escape from what was coming, but she would face it as a mother, determined to protect her children to the very end. The ground trembled as the next wave of artillery struck. The village of Cadena had become a war zone, a place where survival was no longer a given, but a battle fought inch by inch. Tomoko's heart raced as the walls around her groaned under the weight of the explosions. The roof above her began to crack, and dust fell like snow, mixing with the thick smoke that filled the air. The rumble of the blasts echoed in her chest, but it was the pain in her body that pulled her attention. She could feel the first contractions coming. Her child was coming into a world that was being destroyed around her. She didn't know how much longer she could wait in this shattered place, but she had no choice but to endure. Her son Riku clung to her side, his wide eyes full of fear, but he didn't cry. The terror was so familiar that it had become a part of their daily existence. Tomoko reached down, brushing his hair away from his face with trembling hands, trying to reassure him in her soft, steady voice. But inside, she was terrified. Her body ached, her breathing became shallow, and her thoughts were a blur of desperation. There was nowhere to run, no place that could offer the safety she desperately needed. She had no choice but to bring her child into the world amidst this devastation. The pain of labor was sharp, each wave of contraction coming faster than the last. Tomoko's breath hitched as she felt the pressure intensify. She could hear the explosions outside, and with each blast she felt her resolve weakening. There was no comfort, no relief, just the steady rhythm of the bombs and the fierce pain that gripped her body. The ground beneath her seemed to shake more violently with each passing moment, as if the earth itself was being torn apart. Yet, through all the chaos, the thought of her child, the life she was about to bring into this war-torn world, kept her focused. Riku crouched beside her, unaware of the gravity of the situation. He held onto her dress with one hand, his small face a mask of confusion. Tomoko had always been his protector, but now it was the other way around. She could feel his warmth against her, the only comfort in this hellish moment. Her mind raced. She had to keep him safe, even as she fought to bring new life into this broken world. She tried to keep her breathing steady, to reassure him with gentle whispers, but her voice cracked under the strain. The pain in her body surged again, more intense now, and Tomoko gasped. The contractions were coming in rapid succession, and she knew the child was near. Her heart pounded in her chest as she gripped the ground beneath her, bracing herself for what was to come. Her thoughts were clouded with fear, but there was also a deep, instinctive strength rising within her. This child, this tiny life, would not be born into the darkness of this war without a fight. She would give everything for its survival. Suddenly, there was a loud crash, and the house trembled as if it were about to collapse. Tomoko flinched, squeezing her eyes shut against the noise, trying to block out the world that was crumbling around her. The explosion was so close that the air seemed to ripple with the force of it. Dust rained down from the ceiling, and a loud crack echoed as beams from the roof began to splinter. Her heart skipped a beat, and she instinctively threw herself over Riku, shielding him with her body. She could feel the weight of the ceiling above them, and the fear of being crushed gripped her. But as the dust settled, something inside her shifted. The pain from her labor was still there, but she focused on the feeling of Riku's breath against her cheek, on the warmth of his small body pressing against hers. This was what mattered. She had to get through this. She had to survive for him and for the baby that was coming. The noise of the world outside faded into the background as she concentrated on the task at hand. Each contraction was a reminder that life, even amidst destruction, continued to move forward. The pain was almost unbearable now, and Tomoko's body was trembling with exhaustion. Her fingers dug into the earth beneath her as she fought to push through the next wave of contractions. She could feel the baby moving, pushing against her, and she knew that the time was almost here. The ground beneath her seemed to shift again, and another explosion shook the air. Tomoko squeezed her eyes shut, willing herself to stay focused, to hold on just a little longer. She could feel Riku's hand still gripping her, his tiny fingers clutching at her for support. The world outside seemed to disappear as the contractions grew more intense. There was nothing but the burning ache of her body, the pressure in her womb, and the fierce determination that this child would not be born into the chaos of the war. The village around her was falling apart, but she would not let that stop her from bringing her baby into the world. She was a mother, and this was her fight. With one final push, the baby was born. Tomoko let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. For a moment, everything stood still. The pain, the explosions, the fear, all of it seemed to fade away as she held her newborn child in her arms. The world outside was still in chaos, but for this brief moment, there was peace. She looked down at the tiny face in her arms, a fragile new life born amidst the rubble. Despite everything, she had brought him into this world, and that, in itself, was an act of defiance against the war that threatened to consume them all. Riku, who had been so still, now looked up at her with wide eyes. He reached out to touch the baby, his hand trembling with awe. For the first time in what felt like forever, there was a spark of hope in their lives. It was small, fragile, but it was enough. For a moment, they were simply a mother and her children, with the promise of survival in the midst of chaos. The sound of distant gunfire filled the air, but amidst the chaos, something unexpected happened. Tomoko, still cradling her newborn in the crumbling ruins of her home, felt a shift in the atmosphere. For a brief moment, the usual sense of terror that had haunted her for months was replaced by confusion. She heard voices, but they weren't the harsh, commanding tones of the Japanese soldier she had come to fear. They weren't shouting orders or firing in anger. They were speaking in a language she didn't understand. But it was the tone, gentle and calm, that stood out in stark contrast to the harsh reality surrounding her. Her heart raced as the realization hit her. These weren't Japanese soldiers. These were Americans. The very same monsters her village had been taught to hate and fear. The ones who would burn, pillage, and destroy. The ones who had been painted as the enemy in every broadcast and in every whispered rumor. The fear that had held Tomoko for so long now gave way to confusion and disbelief. She had always been taught that if the Americans came, they would be met with death and violence. But these voices, they were not filled with rage. They seemed concerned. The rubble around her shifted as the voices grew closer. Tomoko instinctively pulled her baby closer to her chest, clutching him protectively, as if he could somehow shield her from this new reality. Her mind screamed at her to remain silent, to stay hidden, but as the voices grew louder, she realized that there was no escaping them. A figure appeared from the dust, a man in a green uniform. His eyes were wide with concern, his posture cautious. He was alone, and he didn't appear as the ruthless soldier Tomoko had imagined, but rather a human, just like her. The man knelt down beside her, his hands raised in a universal gesture of peace. He spoke in broken Japanese, his words slow and hesitant. "Is anyone alive?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper. Tomoko froze. This was not the enemy she had been warned about. This man was not here to destroy her. He was here to help. But the years of propaganda flooded her mind, and her instincts screamed for her to stay silent. If he was here to help, why had he come? And why, of all things, was he speaking to her in Japanese? He repeated his words, and Tomoko's gaze flickered to her son, still clinging to her side, and then to the man. Her thoughts were a whirlwind of doubt and fear, but the blood on her hands, the exhaustion in her body, and the child in her arms overwhelmed her caution. She didn't want to die here, not like this, in a broken house surrounded by rubble. She shouted for help, her voice trembling with uncertainty. She didn't know what else to do. She had to take the risk. The man moved quickly, crouching beside her and reaching for the heavy beam that pinned Riku's leg. He grunted with effort, his muscles straining as he shifted the debris with what little strength he had. Tomoko watched in disbelief, her heart pounding as the beam was lifted inch by inch and her son was freed from its grip. Riku cried out in pain, but he was alive. The man did not hesitate. Without a word, he gently checked Riku's leg for any broken bones before looking at Tomoko with a look of reassurance. Despite the language barrier, the message was clear. He was here to help, not harm. Tomoko's mind struggled to process the scene before her. Here, in the midst of a war that had been so relentlessly violent, a stranger was offering her a kind of mercy she had never believed possible. She had been raised to see the American soldiers as monsters, creatures capable of terrible acts. Yet this man's actions were filled with tenderness and care. As he carefully moved Riku, cradling him in his arms as though he were his own child, Tomoko felt something within her shift. Her long-held fear began to crumble, replaced by a deep sense of gratitude. The man looked at her again, his face softening with an expression of compassion. He beckoned for her to follow, pointing towards the open space outside, where the sound of distant gunfire had slowed. Tomoko, still shaken by the surreal nature of the moment, hesitated. She had never considered that she might need to follow an American soldier to safety. She had been prepared to die in this place, to protect her children with her last breath. But now there was a glimmer of hope, hope that maybe, just maybe, survival was still possible. With the sounds of war growing louder in the distance, the man gently helped Tomoko to her feet. She looked down at the newborn, still wrapped in her arms, and then at Riku, who had stopped crying and was staring at the man with wide, curious eyes. The warmth of his body against hers, the tender way he was handled by the soldier, began to calm her racing heart. It was then that she realized that, for the first time in what felt like forever, she was not alone. Someone cared enough to help, even if he was the very person she had been told to fear. The soldier, despite the imminent danger, was steady in his actions. His calmness, his unhurried movements were in stark contrast to the chaos that surrounded them. Every other moment had been a fight for survival, but now there was a strange peace that settled over Tomoko. She had been shown an act of kindness, and it was enough to remind her that, despite everything, humanity still had a place in this war-torn world. As they moved toward the exit, Tomoko could feel her legs shaking, the weight of the situation bearing down on her. She glanced back at the ruined village, the places where her neighbors had once lived, and the memories that now lay in ruins. The thought of leaving, of walking away from the place she had once called home, felt surreal, But she knew there was no turning back. The world had changed, and so had she. What had once been certain, the fear of the enemy, the certainty of death, now felt distant. For the first time in a long while, there was a glimmer of something new, something that could be called hope. The air outside the collapsed building was thick with the smell of smoke and dust, the remnants of a battle that seemed endless. The sounds of distant gunfire echoed through the village, but for the first time in hours, Tomoko could feel the weight of the moment shift. The soldier had led her out of the rubble, and the world outside felt like a new, strange reality. Everything she had been taught to fear was now in front of her. But it was not the nightmare she had envisioned. The soldier, who had saved her son, now led her through the desolation with an unexpected calmness. Tomoko's legs were unsteady beneath her, and her breath came in short, shallow gasps. Her body still ached from the labor, and the exhaustion was starting to take its toll. Her newborn was still cradled in her arms, and Riku, though exhausted, clung to her side, his small hand tightly gripping the hem of her dress. She couldn't help but glance around nervously, aware of the danger that still surrounded them. The explosions had subsided for now, but the threat was far from over. Yet, despite the overwhelming fear, there was a sense of something else creeping in. Something unfamiliar, yet undeniable. Hope. The soldier didn't speak much, but his actions spoke volumes. Every time Tomoko stumbled, he was there, steadying her with a gentle hand. His movements were sure and confident, as if he had done this countless times before. As they moved through the rubble, he kept an eye on her, scanning the area for any signs of danger, but he never seemed panicked. His calm demeanor was a stark contrast to the chaos around them. To Tomoko, it was as though he had entered a world of violence and death and was determined to change the course of her fate, even if only for a moment. They reached a small clearing where a few other soldiers were gathered, speaking in hushed tones. Tomoko could feel the eyes of the others on her, and for a fleeting second, she wondered if they too would look at her with the same hostility she had been taught to expect. But they didn't. Instead, they offered her nods of acknowledgement, some even stepping aside to make room for her. There was no animosity in their gestures, just a quiet understanding that they were here to protect, not to destroy. Tomoko felt a wave of gratitude, though she could not yet fully comprehend the enormity of the situation. These were the soldiers she had been raised to fear, yet they were treating her with something she had not known for a long time: dignity. The world she had known, the one where fear governed every thought and action, was being unraveled piece by piece. She felt as though she were stepping into a new world, one where survival was no longer about fear, but about something else, something she hadn't felt in years. As they walked further, the destruction seemed to grow more intense. The once lush landscape was now a barren wasteland, littered with debris from the war. The houses that had once lined the streets were now reduced to smoldering ruins, their walls broken and their roofs caved in. The path they followed was narrow and treacherous, with jagged rocks and twisted metal strewn across the ground. It felt as though they were walking through a graveyard, each step echoing with the memory of lives lost. Tomoko's heart sank as she glanced at the faces of the other villagers. Many of them had taken refuge in makeshift shelters, their eyes hollow with the weight of the war's toll. But there were also those who had lost everything, who stood in silence, unable to speak or move. She recognized a few of them from her own village, old friends and neighbors who had once been full of life, now reduced to shadows of their former selves. The war had stolen so much from them, leaving only the remains of their homes and families. Despite the overwhelming sorrow around her, Tomoko couldn't help but feel the stirrings of something new. As they continued their journey through the devastated village, she began to realize that the soldier who had saved her and her children wasn't just an isolated incident of mercy in a world of violence. He was part of something larger, something that had the power to change everything. If one soldier could show her kindness, could there be others who felt the same? Could this new world, filled with soldiers who acted with compassion, be the key to healing the wounds that had been inflicted on her people? The path they walked was still perilous, and the distant sounds of war reminded them both that the danger was far from over. But with every step, Tomoko felt herself slowly changing. The fear that had once dominated her thoughts was now tempered with a cautious hope. She looked at the soldier who had saved her, his face still calm and focused, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, she felt a flicker of trust. When they reached the edge of the village, the soldier stopped and turned to her, gesturing toward a small group of American medics who were tending to other villagers. He gave a slight nod, indicating that it was time for her to join them. Tomoka hesitated, her body still shaken from the ordeal, but the soldier's reassuring smile made her move forward. She glanced at Riku, who was now resting in her arms, his tired eyes closed, and then at the newborn, who was still wrapped tightly against her chest. For the first time in a long while, Tomoko felt a sense of relief wash over her. She had made it through the worst, and while the road ahead was still uncertain, she no longer felt entirely alone. There were people here, strangers, enemies even, but their actions had shown her that kindness could exist even in the darkest of times. She had lived through years of propaganda, of hatred and fear, and now she was standing in the midst of something entirely unexpected: humanity. As the soldier walked away, disappearing into the distance, Tomoko took a deep breath, the air heavy with the scent of smoke and the distant sound of battle. But for her, in that moment, it didn't matter. She had survived, and more importantly, she had witnessed something that had shattered the walls of fear that had kept her prisoner for so long. The war was still raging, but for her, the greatest battle had already been won. She had seen the enemy not as a monster, but as a man capable of kindness, and that was a victory that no war could ever take away. As the hours passed, the chaotic sounds of war began to fade into the background, replaced by the steady hum of American soldiers moving through the village. Tomoko, still cradling her newborn in her arms, moved cautiously among the medics and soldiers, her heart heavy with the weight of everything she had just witnessed. She had been led to a small area where the medics were working tirelessly to tend to the injured villagers, and as she watched them, her confusion and fear began to shift into something else, something that felt like awe. She had always known that the world was divided into two camps, those who fought for her country and those who fought against it. But now, in the midst of this broken village, she saw soldiers who were not defined by their nationality, but by the care and compassion they showed to the people around them. The medics were busy treating the wounded, offering water and bandages to those who had survived the bombings and gunfire. Their faces were tired, etched with exhaustion from the days of constant fighting, but their eyes, when they met hers, were filled with something she had not expected: empathy. They weren't just doing their duty, they were truly trying to help. As Tomoko moved through the crowd, she felt a strange sensation settle in her chest. These were the soldiers who had been painted as monsters, and yet here they were, saving lives, offering hope where there had been none. Despite her initial hesitation, Tomoko couldn't deny the impact this had on her. Her entire life had been shaped by the belief that surrender meant dishonor, that the Americans were nothing more than ruthless invaders. But as she looked around at the medics working with a quiet determination, she realized that the world she had been taught to believe in had been a lie. The enemy was not made up of faceless monsters, but of people. People with their own fears, their own hopes, and their own sense of humanity. She couldn't stop the tears that began to form in her eyes, not from fear, but from something deeper, something that felt like a kind of gratitude. As she made her way through the area, Tomoko was drawn to the sight of Sergeant Henley, the man who had saved her son. He was lying on a stretcher, his face pale and his eyes closed, but he was alive. Blood soaked through his uniform, and his breathing was shallow, but the medics were working quickly to stabilize him. Tomoko felt her heart tighten as she watched them. She had never imagined that someone who had risked so much for her and her children would end up lying in front of her, so vulnerable. She felt a wave of guilt wash over her, as though she were the one responsible for his condition. But then she remembered his face, the calm, steady expression he had worn when he saved her son. He had given everything to help them, and now all she could do was hope that he would survive. The medics worked tirelessly, their hands moving with practiced precision as they tended to his wounds. One of them turned to Tomoko, offering a reassuring smile. "He'll make it," the medic said, his voice steady, though there was a hint of worry in his eyes. "He's a tough one." Tomoko nodded, though her heart still ached. She had never seen a soldier up close before, but now she could see the humanity in him. The wounds on his body were not just marks of battle, they were the evidence of a sacrifice made for others. And in that moment, Tomoko realized that it wasn't just the soldiers who had been caught in the war. It was everyone, villagers, soldiers, families, each person trapped by the horrors of this conflict. As night began to fall, the village slowly started to come to life again. The constant tension that had gripped the air all day seemed to dissipate, replaced by a fragile peace. The soldiers, though still wary of any threats, had begun to mingle more freely with the villagers. Some offered food and water, while others simply sat in silence, exchanging small gestures of humanity. Tomoko watched this interaction with a mixture of awe and uncertainty. For the first time in years, it seemed as though the lines between the enemy and the civilian were blurring. The soldiers were no longer just invaders. They were people who had been through their own struggles, and now they were offering help where it was needed most. Her son Riku, who had been silent for most of the day, finally spoke, his voice small but clear. "Mama," he whispered, "are they going to hurt us?" Tomoko knelt beside him, brushing a lock of hair from his forehead. She met his gaze, her heart heavy. She had been so focused on survival that she had forgotten to reassure him. She shook her head softly, her voice gentle. "No, Riku," she said, "they won't hurt us. They're here to help." The words felt strange on her tongue, but as she said them, she knew they were true. She had witnessed their kindness with her own eyes. These were not the monsters she had been told about. These were men and women who, despite the chaos around them, still believed in the possibility of compassion. The hours passed, and Tomoko found herself sitting by Sergeant Henley's side as the medics worked to stabilize him. She felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude, but also a deep, inexplicable sadness. This was a war that had torn apart her world and so many others. And yet, in the midst of all the violence and destruction, there had been moments of tenderness, of sacrifice, and of hope. She had never imagined that a soldier, one of the very people she had been taught to fear, would be the one to show her the meaning of those things. In the quiet of the night, as the stars began to emerge above the ruined village, she allowed herself to believe that perhaps, even in the darkest times, there was a way forward. And that, perhaps, was the greatest victory of all. The medics had stopped working for the night, and the village was settling into a temporary calm. The villagers, once fearful, were now helping the soldiers with whatever they could, offering food, blankets, and whatever else they had. The walls between them were slowly crumbling, piece by piece, just as Tomoko's own understanding of the world had. She no longer saw the American soldiers as the faceless enemy, but as human beings who had their own battles to fight. And though the war was far from over, Tomoko knew that, in this small corner of the world, something had shifted. A new kind of understanding had begun to take root. The next morning brought a stark contrast to the previous day's chaos. The sky, which had been darkened by smoke and fire, was now a clear, pale blue, and the oppressive weight of fear seemed to lift, if only slightly. The sounds of war, though not entirely gone, were quieter now, distant artillery and sporadic gunfire. In the quiet that followed, the village of Cadena, once full of terrified whispers and hurried movements, now held a different kind of silence. It was no longer the silence of despair, but a tentative one, as if the world itself was waiting for something. The rubble, the broken homes, and the displaced families remained, but now there was a new sense of cautious possibility in the air. Tomoko stood by the wreckage of what had once been her home, her newborn cradled in her arms. Riku was at her side, his small hand clutching the hem of her sleeve as he gazed out at the remnants of their village. The images of yesterday, the destruction, the fear, the soldiers, were still fresh in her mind, but they were now joined by new memories. Memories of kindness, of hands reaching out to help, of soldiers treating her not as an enemy, but as a person in need. For the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to feel something other than terror, something closer to hope. The American soldiers, though still on high alert, had begun to work with the villagers in small, quiet acts of cooperation. The men who had once been seen as invaders were now working alongside the civilians to clear the rubble and bring supplies. The medics, who had saved lives the day before, continued their work with quiet determination, tending to the wounded and distributing food and water. Tomoko watched them, her heart heavy with gratitude. She had never imagined that the people who had come to conquer her land would end up being the ones to rebuild it, even if only in small, humble ways. Riku, who had been silent for most of the day, suddenly tugged on Tomoko's sleeve, drawing her attention to a soldier who was kneeling beside a fallen building. The soldier was carefully placing a piece of cloth over the body of an elderly man, his hands gentle as he arranged the fabric. Tomoko felt a wave of emotion rise in her chest. This was not the image of war she had grown up with. She had been taught to believe that soldiers were heartless, driven only by orders to destroy. Yet here was a soldier, offering a final act of dignity to the dead, his actions as human as any she had ever seen. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to imagine that this war might someday be over, that the wounds of the past could heal. The villagers, though still wary, began to emerge from their shelters. Some hesitated, looking toward the soldiers as if expecting them to turn on them at any moment. But there was something different in the air now, something unspoken that seemed to reassure them. Slowly, they began to approach the Americans, offering them food, water, and small tokens of gratitude. The language barrier remained, but the gestures of kindness transcended it. There were no more angry stares, no more whispers of fear. Instead, there were quiet nods of acknowledgement, and for the first time, the villagers saw the soldiers not as enemies, but as fellow human beings, caught in the same war, struggling to survive. Tomoko made her way toward one of the American soldiers, who was sitting near a fire, warming his hands. He looked up as she approached, his face weary but kind. She hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to say. But then she remembered the words she had heard the day before, the words of the soldier who had saved her child. "He's a tough one," the medic had said. Tomoko nodded, still unsure of the customs, but she wanted to say something to show her gratitude. She placed her hands together in a gesture of respect, bowing slightly as she did. The soldier watched her for a moment, his expression unreadable, and then he stood up slowly, mirroring her gesture. He didn't say anything, but the small, respectful nod he gave her spoke volumes. Tomoko felt a lump form in her throat. It was a simple exchange, but it carried a weight that she couldn't put into words. She realized then that it wasn't just her life that had been saved. It was her understanding of what it meant to be human, to show compassion, to look beyond fear and hatred. This soldier, who had once been her enemy, had become her savior, not just in the physical sense, but in the emotional one as well. Later in the day, the soldiers set up a small makeshift camp at the edge of the village, and Tomoko joined the other villagers in helping to prepare food for the weary troops. As she worked alongside them, she noticed how the soldiers interacted with the children, offering them small trinkets or just a smile. It was a simple act, but to the children it was a world away from the terrifying images they had grown up with. For the first time, they were no longer afraid of the soldiers. The monsters they had been told to fear were now just men, with stories, with lives, with hopes of their own. As the evening drew near, the village seemed to settle into a quiet rhythm, with the sounds of people working together filling the air. The tension of the previous days had given way to a tentative peace. Tomoko sat by the fire, her newborn sleeping peacefully in her arms, and Riku at her side, now calmer than he had been for days. The fear that had once gripped her heart was still there, lurking in the background, but it was no longer the overwhelming force it had been. She had witnessed a change, not just in her village, but in herself. She had seen the enemy not as monsters, but as people who were capable of acts of kindness, of mercy. And that small, quiet realization had begun to shift something deep inside her. That night, as the village settled into a quiet, fragile peace, Tomoko looked up at the stars above. For the first time in a long time, she felt the weight of the past lift just a little. The war was not over, and the road ahead would be long and difficult, but something had changed in her heart. She had witnessed humanity in its purest form, and that was enough to make her believe that, perhaps, there was hope for a future where fear and hatred no longer held sway. The dawn of a new beginning had arrived, not with the end of war, but with the small, quiet victories of compassion and understanding.